coming and sharing their expertise. And then we separated the investment discussion on the second day because we do have diverse group, and some family members are very interested in investment, some are not. And then for the investment, we also include the outside investment community. So tomorrow there's a investment meeting, and I hope you can join. In the afternoon also there's a social event we organize, which is the visit to the New York Institute of Art. So if you're an art lover, that would be a great opportunity. Okay, great. Now, I pass it to Roy to start our session.
Okay.
Yes.
My great-grandfather, Elias Niederhoffer, came to America from a very small town in Romania, in the northeast of Romania and Moldova, called Suret. All the Niederhoffers in the world come from this one place. And he came on a boat and bought a push cart and sold fruit on Essex Street in Manhattan, downtown. And his son, his oldest son, Martin, my grandfather, was a great success. Didn't go to college, but he became an accountant. But he was a musician also. He played the piano. Music has always been part of my family's world. And Martin had the job, which doesn't exist anymore, but back then a lot of people did it. He was a silent movie pianist. He would improvise the soundtrack of movies because they had no sound. And he wanted to get good at this. So he realized that one of his accounting firm's clients was a very good piano teacher. So he took lessons. After his first lesson, he came back from the lesson and said to his wife, my grandmother, Bertie, "Bertie, they are so poor up in Harlem, they don't have enough money for clothing. They just walk around in towels. So we should bring them some towels." And the story was that my grandmother and grandfather gave towels to the piano teacher for the next lesson. So they would have clothes and gave them clothes. Now, it turns out that the piano teacher was a guy that you might have heard of. His name is Scott Joplin, who invented ragtime, which is the precursor of jazz. You might know the movie The Sting, and you've heard many of his compositions. And my grandfather was his student. And my grandmother was interviewed 70 years later for a book, a biography of Scott Joplin. And when we read the book, I was very excited, it turned out that there was a reason why Scott Joplin had a home in which everyone was walking around in towels. And the reason was that Scott Joplin, the piano teacher's wife, was running the largest whorehouse. I actually have a picture. Can I just pull up your email? Sorry, where's Leah?
Yes.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Just pull up your email. We actually have a painting of this. Not a photograph, sadly, but I just sent it to you. Let's see if we can pull it up for a second.
Oh, okay, sure.
That is really funny.
Should be right at the top of your email.
Okay.
Anything?
No, I have to log into the right.
There it is. Okay. Yeah, just pull that one right up. So this is Scott Joplin.
Oh my God.
Here's my grandfather. And you can see what's going on here and here. And my friend Adam painted this to give you a sense of what New York was like in this time. Everything is historically accurate. This is a real house still up in Harlem. And so towels turned out to be a very interesting, iconic object for our family. I studied neuroscience at Harvard, and one of the people that I encountered in my studies of neuroscience was a guy named Daniel Gilbert, who teaches the most popular course at Harvard called How to Be Happy. He wrote a book called Stumbling on Happiness. And strangely enough, he also talks about towels, but they're not so positive. And in Daniel Gilbert's story, towels are a symbol of what can make you really unhappy in a relationship. Now, I don't know if you have a pet peeve or something that really gets you angry. This does happen to be one of mine. Someone who leaves their towels on the floor in the bathroom every morning. You walk in and there's wet towels on the floor, really makes me upset. And no matter how good that person is, that person might, save your children from a burning building. But if your partner does something that makes you upset every single day that you are with them, it can actually change your level of happiness. And Gilbert actually shows that surrounding yourself with moments that are very frequent, that are slightly negative, can actually make you very, very unhappy over time and lead to the end of relationships or broadly unhappiness. And I think one of the characteristics of running a business that I've encountered is there's a lot of those. There's a lot of people that want stuff from you. There's a lot of people that want money from you. There's a lot of people that want your time and your advice. And there's this great little epigram: if you want money, ask for advice. If you want advice, ask for money. Ponder that. It's very powerful, especially in nonprofits. The time that this takes can be quite demanding on your psyche and eventually lead to some rather negative feelings, even though as a successful family you've had tremendous success and you got the big win. We all got the big win in our families, but yet the day-to-day can be quite negative. So Gilbert suggests a solution for this, which I'm going to come back to. I'd like to talk about the continuation of how music ended up as a theme in my family. Martin, sadly, after a little bit of success as a pianist and also as an accountant, decided to get involved in the stock market in the 20s and became very successful in real estate. He was kind of a young Donald Trump. He would, in very small scale, he would make little deals and promote things. He was kind of a macher, we call it. And unfortunately, in 1929, he was completely wiped out, and he never could buy a stock again because of the memory of that. I'm just going to put my little camera here. So investing became a difficult thing. My father was a policeman. That was my grandfather's oldest son. Arthur is my father. And before World War II, he didn't want to go in the army. He had a law degree, and there were no jobs for Jewish lawyers. So he decided that he was going to take the first civil service exam that came up, which was the police exam, and ended up getting in. They only took 1%. 1 out of 100 applicants got in that year. I think it was 1941. And he was a cop for 20 years with a law degree, and eventually he even got a PhD in sociology and eventually became a professor. But he would always tell my brother, who's much older than I am, when my brother would express some interest in earning some money through investing and gambling. He was a poker player. He would hustle everybody. He was a great racket sports player. My brother actually ended up the world champion in squash in the 70s. But back then, as a little 9 and 11-year-old, he could win $20 pretty easily if you didn't know what was coming, because he could beat pretty much everybody in all of Brooklyn. So my brother was very interested in investing. My father would say, do not be a gambler. Do not invest in the stock market. Every day I work on the Bowery and clean up the dead bums who have died after losing all their money and become alcoholics lived on the Bowery. Now, of course, it's all fancy hotels, but back then, as you probably know from New York history, the Bowery was the place where people went to die. And my father's job was to clean up the corpses, among other things. So we had a kind of negative experience with investing, but my brother stuck with it and became a very early pioneer of behavioral finance. One thing that I love that he found is that he did a study of stock performance based on the first letter of the company's name, and he found out that stocks that were earlier in the alphabet tended to outperform. Now, why might that be? Well, back then, everybody had stock tables in a newspaper, so you go through the A's and, oh, look at that exciting A company and the B company, and then you get a little distracted. By the time you get to the S companies, you're not interested anymore. So people buy A through D and not Q through Z. So he actually turned that into an interesting business that he ran for, and actually still investing after, I think, a 50-plus year career in investing that we'll come back to in a moment. But with my brother being a world champion athlete and a super rich guy, those are some pretty big shoes to fill. So my thing became music. My parents gave me violin lessons when I was 4 and piano lessons beginning when I was 5, and that became the joy that I had. I wasn't a very good and diligent practicer, but I actually did continue, and I still play. I play about 15 instruments today. And when I look back at my life, even more than my business life, it's been my involvement in music that has provided so much of the interesting, fulfilling, and valuable experience, and even fed back into my business and provided good things for my business. So I thought I would talk about a few examples of that. One of the things I've learned from music, and one of the things everyone learns, I think, from music, is that you can take very, very small steps over long periods of time and learn a very, very complex skill. And when I learned what a computer was back in the late 70s, I said, wow, this is really exciting. And it was exactly the same thing. Programming is literally breaking an algorithm is different pieces of a problem broken down and then put together in an interesting way. And there's a lot to do with programming, and I think the common perception that music and math have something to do with each other probably is literal, that math also has that quality, and certainly programming does. So I got pretty good at that, and my first business was a computer game business. Back in, I started when I was 13. I ended up a few years later with about 30 employees, and I put myself through college with it, and it was, I think I had more employees back then than I do now, and almost at my peak in numbers of employees. I hit it when I was 16 years old, making what you would call now casual games. We ended up doing 400 titles in 1 year in 1982, which was an interesting process. But I got a little bored with programming, and I decided I was going to go and study neuroscience, because that seemed like the most interesting problem in the world. And the other thing I was pretty interested in was girls. And when I got to college, I got really lucky. I was opposite, across a hall from the prettiest girl in the Harvard freshman class. And I knew this because we had the Facebook, which was that back then. It was a red book with everybody's picture in it, and then you could just go through. And my roommate Tom conveniently had memorized it, so he knew everybody's name from this, just like in Facebook, you could identify people. And I knew that Jonna Gaberman was the girl that I wanted to date. So it took a while, but I actually had the good idea to befriend her roommate, who was a violinist. So we played together, so the violin helped me there. And finally, I got Jonna to go to the symphony with me. And we saw Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And I remember this like it was yesterday. In Symphony Hall, it was the Boston Philharmonic, and we were about to start the symphony. And I said, I bet you've heard this before. What do you think of this piece? And she said, I don't think I've heard Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And I said, how is that possible? And I realized, okay, well, most people hear the Ode to Joy, da 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 da, right? We've all heard this either from classical music, but most people hear it for the first time in church. Jonna's Jewish, so she'd never been to church, and she wasn't a classical music fan, so she'd never heard this piece before. Now I knew it. I knew pretty much every note of this piece, and there was this person sitting here about to hear a live version of maybe the greatest work of music ever composed, and for the first time. And I looked at her what was her reaction going to be? What was her emotional state? How would she respond to it? And it was like in Pretty Woman. Remember Julia Roberts listening to the opera? It's you can just watch it on silent. It's one of the greatest bits of acting I've ever seen. Just the emotions that wash over her face. I saw that happen with Jonna. And that became my life after that. I decided to try to answer the question, is there something different between the brains, it's okay, of musicians and non-musicians? Does something change in your brains to actually give you those responses and change it how I felt versus what she felt? So that became my research. And I was all set to do that. I applied to Cambridge, and I found that the idea of making a musical instrument that you can control with your brain was an interesting problem. So I was all set to do that after university, and instead my brother, who was an investor, asked me to come to New York and program and help him with his business. So I ended up doing that instead, but I came very close to making music my literal area of expertise and interest in the academy. But I turned out to be a quantitative hedge fund manager instead. What I learned from Jana was, by the way, that was the last date I ever had for some reason. And so I learned only date musicians. There's something that seems to work, and that didn't work. But my ex-wife, my wife, and the prior 4-year romance that I had all were with singers. So there appears to be something that music brought to me that was beyond just me personally, but in romance. Along the way, I stopped playing violin for a while, but I always would take it out and play at parties. And a guy that I knew from growing up called me about 10 years after college and said, "Roy, I haven't talked to you in a long time, but I want you to know, I'm out of music." And this was a guy that was maybe the best clarinetist in all of Long Island back in the 80s. And I couldn't believe it. I said to him, "David, how is that even possible?" He said, "Well, I tried to be a conductor, it didn't work out. I do computers now." So I said, "Okay, I'm giving this party. A lot of people play at the party. We jam, we play all sorts of fun stuff. Why don't you come and play at the party?" He said, "Well, I don't even have a clarinet." I said, "Don't worry, I'll get someone to bring a clarinet." And there I saw yet another beautiful moment where someone was moved by music, where David, who had been a phenomenal player but had completely left music, put a clarinet in his mouth, and it was like a wave of joy came over him. And he later told me that night, "This was the first time in my life that music has just been for fun." And he wanted to do it again. And so we got together and we played 4-hands piano, and then trios, and then quartets, and an octet. And then finally he had this idea to read a symphony, and he wanted to conduct. At the end of that, which we did, he said, "Wouldn't it be great that if we could somehow make this a thing and play, like, imagine if we could do Beethoven's Ninth in Carnegie Hall someday with big chorus." Fast forward 20 years, we've done Beethoven's Ninth twice in Carnegie Hall. Avery Fisher, we played Mozart Requiem in this orchestra that he founded, and I actually have to practice after I'm done with this. I have to practice for an hour because we were first rehearsals tonight. After 20 years, we're still at it. It's all non-professional musicians. So here music has been something that turned out to not be a career choice for everybody in the orchestra, but something that everybody gets an enormous amount of love for. So the direct impact of music has been enormous on these people. And there's something else, though, that happens with music. Not only does one learn practical skills from learning musical instruments, and by practical I mean that you can divide a problem into small pieces and solve it that way, like practicing a complicated section. Playing with an ensemble. Music is one of the activities that involves some of maybe the most focus when you're playing with other people on both what you're doing at the highest possible level and what other people are doing, that you have to be completely in sync with them for the longest period of time. A symphony movement can be 60 minutes where you're just playing straight. And if you lose your focus even for 1 second, you're dead. So it creates an interesting set of cognitive skills. But over the last 20 and 30 years, some research says that music is actually doing something else. And this is why early music education is so important, beyond just all the joys that I've described so far. Music seems to make people smarter. Most people say, "Oh, it makes your spatial reasoning, it makes your math skills better." It looks like it's something even beyond that. It's IQ. It's the thing that we all want. General intelligence makes you live longer. It makes you happier. It makes your marriage last longer. It makes you earn more. Your health is better. You're less likely to end up in jail. All these things are highly correlated with intelligence. And it's my belief that music education, because of its neurological impact, because of what auditory perception has to do with language acquisition and has to do with spatial reasoning. It turns out that all the research points to broad-based increases in general intelligence, and it's probably the only thing that's been shown reliably by cognitive psychology and neuroscience to increase general intelligence with all these phenomenal outcomes. So I think music education is possibly the greatest gift that you can give your children, your grandchildren, and even yourself as one continues in life. So along the way, I've made that one of my philanthropic. Sure.
Roy, is that creating music or is that listening to music? I'm gonna ask because
Produce-
now you've sold me on it, and I wanna.
This would be the process of learning a musical instrument because of the fine sequencing of time that you have to do, the tone. There's a lot of tasks that one does neurologically that seem to have an impact on general intelligence, and it's probably lifelong, although that's actually never been studied. We know that musicians tend to resist Alzheimer's better, and you've probably seen videos of people who are completely unable to function, but they can still play the piano. Even my grandfather and grandmother, I remember late in their lives, were able to play some of Scott Joplin's old music that they learned 75 years before. So it appears that music education has something special. But even that doesn't encompass all of the interesting and rewarding things that music can do for you. In my investment side, after the global financial crisis, I became very concerned that what the Federal Reserve was doing would, by essentially printing money, quantitative easing, was going to lead to massive inflation. And I thought to myself, as a leader of a family, I wanted to preserve wealth, and just in case, as my great-grandparents did coming to America, just in case I had to leave, I watched the literally Occupy Wall Street come and march and the angry mob in front of John Paulson's house. And that's not something that, as a hedge fund manager, you like to see. I mean, he's obviously a lot more successful than I am, but still, it's pretty close when the mob is literally at your door. So I asked myself, what is it that can be really portable and really valuable, that just in case you had to leave somewhere and go there fast, would be portable and have a fixed supply? So gold is interesting, but the reality is, for most of us in this room, the amount of gold, 50 pounds of gold in a suitcase gets you pretty far. But I think it's something like $10 million of gold is like 6 60-pound suitcases, and they won't even let you on the plane. So you're not going to get anywhere with your gold. You need a boat or something like that to go with it. So is there anything better than that? So I had the idea that music could provide an answer there too. Rare violins are, you've heard the term, the Stradivarius of automobiles, the Stradivarius of whatever. Well, what about the actual Stradivarius violins? Antonio Stradivari from 1680 to 1730. So this is George Washington was a little kid, and Stradivari had been producing violins for 40 years before George Washington was a little kid. It's Louis XIV is around, and he created the only thing I can think of in the history of civilization that a tool of art, a violin, has been produced with the perfect form that has never been improved upon in 300 years. Can you think of any item that 300 years ago was perfected and has never been improved upon for 300 years? I mean, it's hard. I'm sure there are a few examples. I'm curious if you have any. And as soon as I said, okay, well, and there are only about 700 of them. And they have a 300-year track record of about 8 to 10% a year, and they've never had a down year. I said, okay, this is a pretty good investment. So I became interested and bought a collection of rare violins, which I think is fungible. And now, interestingly, this particular asset class is starting to become interesting in the Far East. There are 40 million violin students in China. Everyone who succeeds at violin wants to play on a violin made by either Stradivari or Guarnerius is the other one. They call it Guarneri del Gesù. So the total supply is about 850 instruments for, let's call it, 5,000 phenomenal violinists coming out of China and the entire world. And sometimes things happen, like there's one that the concertmaster of the Los Angeles Philharmonic drove off the road on the Pacific Coast Highway and ended up in the Pacific in his car, and the violin floated away. Somebody found the violin the next day. It fell apart, but they put it back together, and I've actually played that violin, and it sounds great. So violins are an amazing thing. They have these stories associated with them. Each one is ex Joachim, the great violin pedagogue, ex Count Esterhazy, the great business leader from the 19th century. They all have the names and have a permanence. So it's an interesting asset class. So even from an investing side, I became interested in music as an investment. Another way that, by the way, that I got excited about back then was Bitcoin. Similarly, highly portable, fixed supply, highly fungible anywhere in the world. And so they always say in these conferences, ask me about cryptocurrency at some point. I have a lot to say on that. But the difference between violins and Bitcoin, by the way, and gold, is that there's a robust ecosystem in cryptocurrency. You can't, once you put money in a violin, you can't use that money to do anything else once you have the violin. Like art, the same thing. It's hard to monetize a Picasso, but you can monetize cryptocurrency. So that to me is the interesting piece of it. Okay, that's a little aside. So another way that music can enrich one's life besides investing is in creating art that is permanent. The expression, life is short and art is long, right? We all know that. And it's really true. People talk about having seen Maria Callas perform an opera, or the day that John Paul Jones did Othello, James Earl Jones did Othello, and these iconic performances that people talk about for centuries, literally, from the art and artistic works. One of the only business people that you can remember from the 19th century is Count Esterhazy. Why? He commissioned works of music. You may have heard of the Archduke Trio by Beethoven. Archduke Rudolph was a guy. He was a nobleman, sure, but the way we remember him was he was a rich guy and he loved music, and he paid for Beethoven. He commissioned some pieces from Beethoven. So I got very interested in opera, and along the way I found myself on the board of New York City Opera when it went bankrupt in 2013. And after a litigation battle, I never had a lawsuit in my life except when I tried to do something good and help New York City Opera out. The bankruptcy litigation took 2 years, but eventually we won, and we reorganized New York City Opera, and we're performing again since 2016. We're about to start our 4th season. And so I'm the board chair of that. And so the opera as well. I've had this extraordinary experience of meeting people, the greatest artists of our day, of commissioning works, and probably no one's going to remember my hedge fund, but they might just remember that I'm the guy that helped New York City Opera out when they needed it, or the works, or even more important, the work of art that we produce, that somebody said, wow, the Campagna Sommersa that we did in 2016 was so beautiful. They remember it for a lifetime. There's this beautiful movie called Coco that you might have seen, the Pixar movie, and one of the themes that they address so beautifully in the movie is the idea that no one is ever dead until the last person has forgotten them. And art has that quality of permanence that you and your family can become, like the Esterhazys, unforgettable because you're attached to something that's really permanent, like a work of art. Finally, the most recent thing that my family's been involved with is my wife is trained in musical theater as a performer, but she developed tremendous business skill over the years, and now she's a commercial Broadway producer. So as an investment in performing arts, music can provide amazing rewards. Don't be a plain investor in these things. There's a lot of little financial tricks and ways that the producers have to make money that the investors don't have. So you've probably heard, you may have even seen the movie The Producers, about how bad an investment it is to be an investor in a Broadway show. However, it doesn't take much money, $25,000, $50,000, to become a co-producer of interesting works, and that has much better economics for it, and you get to participate on all the calls and see the ins and outs of Broadway. You're there on the opening night, you know everything that's going on. It's very rewarding. As beyond it can be an interesting investment, it can be rewarding as a way to bring art into your life. And musical theater is one of the unique American art forms. Maybe that and jazz are probably the two unique musical forms that have been developed in America. So there's another way to do it. And finally, music provides something, I think, for all of us, if you listen to music, that will bring us back to the close of this, the opening of this. Gilbert, the neuroscientist, says that there's a flip side of the guy that the wife or husband that leaves their towels on the floor every day, and it just destroys your marriage after a while. But instead, you can have the opposite. You can have a terrific tragedy in your life, and what Gilbert calls your psychological immune system inoculates you, and eventually you return to your original level of happiness. Things that you never could dream you could survive: a loss of a limb, the death of a child, a divorce, these things that shake us to the core. When people are asked 5 or 10 years later, how do you feel? They're just as happy as they were before. And they can't imagine life any other way. And the flip side of this, what about small good things? Do they make us happier? Just like the towels make us unhappy over time. Small good things that occur over and over again, the little joys of daily life, will actually make us happier over time. And for those of us running businesses where you have this potential negative, every day something is, oh, what's going to happen today? And the huge joy of your financial and family success. The flip side of that is the beauty and joy that small things can bring you every day will actually improve the happiness of you and your family over time. And it's my view that music is one of the things, as it has for me, in all of its different forms. Learning to play an instrument, investing in it for the long term, having fun with philanthropy with it, listening to it, can bring you those joys that will make you happier and make eventually your permanence assured for your family and for history. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't know if I have any questions on that.
I've got a question. How are you dealing with transitioning to get your kids to be involved in music?
Well, so far I've been fortunate, at least with my first son, who's now 21. He, unlike me, actually, in fact, unlike everybody in my family, he really does want to be a professional musician now. He said to me recently, you know, when I was little, I wanted to be one of two things. I wanted to be either president or I wanted to be a professional musician. But he realized he was a good violist, but maybe not a great violist. So he picked something exactly in the middle, and he started conducting. So that's his choice, and he's about to apply to Juilliard and Curtis, and hopefully he'll have a nice career as a musician. My daughter, who's now 18, was a great violinist, but when she was about 10, she said, you know, Dad, I hate this. And I don't like playing the violin. And I was crushed, you know. I thought everybody in my family would play the violin after, just like me. Well, yeah, we know if you have kids, you know that doesn't work. So I said, well, what do you love to do? She said, I love to tap dance.